The state of Nebraska, and only the state of Nebraska, gets a pass on paying anything at all for a nationwide expansion of Medicaid. Senate health reform bill would make more people eligible for Medicaid. And under the bill, every other state in the country will help pay for its own new Medicaid patients. But not Nebraska. Nebraska is special. Nebraska's new Medicaid patients will be paid for 100% by the federal government. Why are Nebraska's Medicaid patients so special? Because the majority does not rule in the United States Senate, because a 60-vote supermajority is now required to pass anything in the United States Senate. And of course, more specifically, because Nebraska Senator Ben Nelson is so conservative that he represents the 60th of those 60 votes that Democrats needed to pass reform, which makes all Nebraskans very special. Incidentally, there are a lot of free Medicaid for Nebraska type stories buried inside the Senate bill, a lot of which are not particularly infuriating on policy grounds. They're more curious than infuriating, but all of them indicate a whack process in the Senate. Thanks to Montana Senator Max Baucus, for example, residents of one small town, Libby, Montana, who have health problems caused by asbestos exposure, it's from a now closed mineral mine there, those people will be eligible for Medicare coverage. And Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, he won more than $10 billion for community health centers across the country, including at least 2 in his home state. When you absolutely need every single vote in your 60-member caucus, you have to start meeting every single individual senator's demands, at least the senators who choose to make them. This system, this idea that the Senate can't pass any legislation without 60 votes, allows the minority to exploit a Senate rule in order to thwart the will of the majority. Majorly. It also makes individual senators remarkably powerful if they choose to be obstructionist in their own right. The filibuster is not in the Constitution. It is a rule imposed on the Senate by the Senate, and its use has increased dramatically in recent years. Here's a chart that we've used before on the show to illustrate the growing use/abuse of the filibuster. Shows how many times the Senate voted on ending a filibuster in each session over the course of my lifetime, starting in 1973, just to pick an arbitrary date when it happened 31 times. But you look at that huge spike at the end of the graph, that's the 110th Congress. That's the first term after the Democrats won control of the Senate in 2006. Suddenly the filibuster's on the table at that point 112 times. Here's another way to look at it. In his New York Times column today, Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman points to research which puts the filibuster into percentages. In the 60s, only about 8% of major legislation was affected by the filibuster or the threat to filibuster. By the 1980s, it was 27%. And by 2007, 70% of all major legislation faced a filibuster threat. That's a quantitative change so big, it's a qualitative change. In other words, the 60-vote threshold might as well be an official Senate rule now. And that has, of course, policy implications that make no sense for the country at all. Joining us now is the Washington Post's Ezra Klein. Ezra, thanks very much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
How are you, Rachel?
Senate Democrats just operate under the assumption that they will need 60 votes for everything now. Do they have a choice?
Not really. I mean, you could have gone through reconciliation, which was the other option here, but that means you can't do anything the way you'd normally do it. It's an arcane process, completely hemmed in by rules. You couldn't have insurance market regulations on and on. They do think they need 60 votes to pass any legislation normally. And as you pointed out in the intro to the segment here, that's a very new fact in the history of the Senate. It didn't used to be like that. When Lyndon Johnson passed Medicare, you know, they wrote a memo internally in his administration. It just said, you get 55 votes, you're done. Nobody would write that memo in the Obama administration.
Well, how did we get to this point? Obviously, a decision was made to start using the filibuster in, as I said, a qualitatively different way. It was initially, almost by definition, something that was very rarely used, something that defined an extreme circumstance in the Senate. But there was this very clear pivot point after the 2006 midterms for the 110th Congress that it was going to be used all of the time. Do we know anything about that decision?
A bit. It's a mixture of rule changes and strategy changes. It begins with Mike Mansfield, sort of a legendary old Senate leader who created something called dual tracking, wherein it used to be that if you filibustered, everything came to a stop. It was like stopping a car on a one-lane highway. Dual tracking made it so you could filibuster something, they would do that for a little bit, they'd come back, check in tomorrow if it was still filibustering. If they were, they'd come back to it the day after that. So the cost of filibustering got a lot lower. As that happened, people didn't really filibuster that much more. Still, by custom, it wasn't done much. Then you have Gingrich and Bob Dole in the 90s who realized you can overturn essentially the Democratic majority by making them into a failure, by, the American people don't reward you if you don't get anything done. And then after, in the late sort of aughts, you begin to have this situation in which it just is constant. And part of that story is just wild polarization in the country, right? I mean, you look at Glenn Beck, you look at what's going on out there. There is no political upside to cooperating. And, I think what political scientists say on this now is that you can have a system, right, in which the minority party has either the incentive to see the majority fail or it has the power to make them fail. But you really can't run a country if they have both.
Yeah. Well, this has been a subject of frustration to people in both parties at different times and at different, more and less convenient intervals. I know that the Gang of 14 idea came up when Republicans felt like Democrats in the minority in the Senate were filibustering too many judicial nominees. The way they hammered out a deal on essentially making Democrats approve all Bush judicial nominees, almost all of them, was by threatening to get rid of the filibuster altogether. How hard is it to get rid of the filibuster? I feel like I've read a lot of different analysis about how many votes it would take and what process you'd need to kill it if you wanted to.
People disagree on this. Well, what they do agree on is that if you tried to get rid of the filibuster, what the minority would do is essentially bring the Senate to a halt. The Senate doesn't just run on the filibuster. It also runs on what's called unanimous consent, where everybody has to agree to do things. Everybody has to agree. That's how folks held up health care reform actually in the beginning of the debate this time around. So Republicans could really stop the chamber, just as Democrats threatened to do in 2005 when Bill first threatened to remove the filibuster. What you would basically, I think, need to have happen is Congress would need to remember that it is supposed to be an independent branch of government that is supposed to be able to act on major going concerns. And so you'd have the two parties get together and decide we don't want it to be the case that when we're in the majority, we can't do any of the things we promise the American people we do. And so 6 years from today, when we don't know who will be in power, the filibuster phases out. But for that to happen, you need Congress to begin acting like a branch of government and not just an attachment or an accessory of the president, which hasn't been the case for some time now.
Ezra Klein of the Washington Post, great to have your analysis on this. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.